Opening the center immediately, this thrust seeks dynamic play and rapid development for the king's bishop. Instantly challenging the center, this counterthrust opens lines and forces white to consider immediate pawn exchanges. Opens a central file and immediately challenges black's pawn structure. Retrieving the pawn immediately recaptures material, but allows white a central knight outpost and opens the d-file for potential pressure. Developing the knight here immediately challenges the queen and initiates central pressure. The queen retreats, relinquishing central influence and allowing white's knight to develop further with tempo on the queen. Developing knights to active squares and preparing for kingside castling is paramount for white's initiative. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies the center and prepares for castling, while keeping the queen mobile. Establishing a central pawn presence now offers white excellent control over key squares, preparing to launch an attack. Developing the bishop to this active square directly challenges the knight, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing white to clarify their piece development. Dislodging the bishop gains valuable space and prepares potential pawn advances, but watch out for counterplay on the weakened kingside. Sacrificing the bishop for doubled pawns offers black immediate central pressure and a potentially weakened white kingside. Reclaiming the pawn with your queen opens a clear diagonal for your bishop and pressures black's central pawn structure. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain solidifies black's central presence, creating a more robust pawn structure for future play. Unleashing a bishop's diagonal power towards the queen's current refuge, this development subtly prepares for a kingside assault. Solidifying central control and preparing castling, this maneuver neatly tucks the pawn away from the bishop's watch. Secure king and prepare for central pawn advances. Solidifying central influence, the knight prepares to join the queenside pressure and support a potential e5 push. Developing the bishop to f4 squares, its gaze towards the vulnerable black kingside, preparing for future central advances and potential pressure on that wing. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the king's defense and prepares for castling, a crucial step for king's safety in this open position. Bringing the rook to the king's flank reinforces that side for potential offensive operations. Securing the monarch is paramount, and castling achieves this splendidly, readying the rook for potential action. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this seemingly quiet maneuver anticipates potential queenside expansion and avoids pawn weaknesses. Preparing to contest the central e-file, this rook's repositioning aims to enhance piece synergy and potentially liberate the d7 knight. Elevating the bishop to g3 prepares potential queenside pressure, subtly nudging black's pieces out of optimal squares. Rerouting the queen to b6 seeks counterplay along the b-file and eyes the c3 knight, while indirectly preparing a d5 pawn push. Reasserting central influence and preparing for potential kingside pawn advances. Establishing central control with the rook anchors the queenside structure and prepares potential pressure along the d-file. Expands queenside space, threatening to disrupt black's rook if it retreats, while also preparing for a potential c2-c4 pawn push to seize central initiative. Realigning the knight to its f8 outpost is a patient repositioning, aiming to reinforce the kingside and prepare for a more active role in the center. Reclaiming the d-file and preparing for eventual central pawn advances, this move signals white's intent to consolidate and exert pressure. Reasserting central influence, black aims to activate the bishop on a more commanding diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Unleashing knight dominance, this jump eyes critical central squares and prepares a swift attack. Challenging the central pawn structure, this exchange aims to simplify while disrupting white's knight activity and potentially opening lines for black's rook. Recapturing the pawn opens a critical file for your rook, aiming for central control. Opening the g-file to attack the king's vicinity is a bold, strategic gamble, potentially leaving the queen exposed. Reclaiming the pawn opens vital lines for the queen, preparing an aggressive assault. Consolidating material and preparing to challenge, the d-file shows a patient buildup of counterplay. Consolidating central control and preparing to challenge the d-file. This move fortifies white's pawn structure while eyeing future piece activity. Consolidating queenside pressure becomes a priority as the rook now eyes the d-file. Pressing the queenside pawns now opens up critical lines for your rooks. Seeking to centralize the queen and potentially reposition it for defense or counterplay. Threatening the f7 pawn. This aggressive thrust opens up immediate tactical avenues towards black's vulnerable monarch. The queen retreats, preparing to defend the queenside while keeping an eye on the kingside shadows. Expanding on the queenside, this pawn advances, seeking open lines and restricting black's counterplay while preparing to activate the rook. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure offers support for future queenside expansion. Initiating a rook lift to potentially threaten the kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure. Consolidating the rook on the d-file aims to contest open lines and prevent white's queen from asserting dominance in the center. Asserting central pawn presence, this gambit seeks to pry open lines for aggressive action. A thoughtful repositioning, seeking to protect the b6 pawn and potentially prepare for a future queenside pawn push. Reasserting pressure on the queenside pawn chain while creating new attacking avenues. Consolidating the rook on the c-file aims to contest control, but it overlooks the immediate threat on the kingside. Pushing pawns forward aggressively on the kingside creates overextension, potentially weakening the king's sanctuary. Fortifying the king's shelter with this pawn advance, black aims to prevent future central infiltration, albeit at the cost of weakening the dark squares. Initiating a decisive pawn thrust on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for the rook. Solidifying the king's position offers a welcome respite from white's queenside pressure. Reasserting central influence, the queen eyes opportunities on the kingside, preparing a potential assault. Breaking open the c-file with this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's central presence and creates new avenues for black's pieces. Prying open the center, this advance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and activate the rook on the open file. Opening the queenside files offers a dynamic opportunity, but watch for your king's safety as play intensifies. Unleashing the king's pawn creates immediate chaos, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure. Capturing the pawn forcefully opens critical lines, but exposes your king to the oncoming avalanche. Unleashing a rook, white aims to dismantle black's pawn shield and expose the king. Sacrificing material to open lines, you've unleashed chaos around white's king. Recapturing with the queen drastically simplifies the position, forcing an exchange that favors white's material advantage. Seizing the open file offers a tempting opportunity, but it critically weakens your king's defenses. Unleashing the rook on the 7th rank, white aims to shatter black's pawn structure and create immediate threats. Sensing danger, black attempts to liberate their rook from white's aggressive cavalry charge, hoping to defend the compromised pawn structure. Seizing the open file forces the exchange, simplifying into a favorable rook endgame. Recapturing the pawn with the knight repositions it to a more active central square, potentially targeting white's weakened kingside pawns. Securing the pawn on d4 simplifies the position, aiming for a favorable endgame by simplifying the queenside material. The pawn's advance, though seemingly simple, opens a desperate gamble for survival in this compromised endgame. Reclaiming a pawn and clearing the way for queen activity, this looks to exploit the isolated pawn structure. Sacrificing the pawn now opens vital diagonals for white's bishop and queen, creating a dangerous discovered attack. Unleashing a discovered check, this queen sacrifice opens a decisive attack against black's exposed monarch. The king, now exposed on the open file, faces immediate threats and needs urgent shelter. Unleashing a forcing sequence, white aims to exploit black's exposed monarch and secure material gain. The king's escape route is now wide open, begging for swift, decisive action. Returning the queen to this square forces a king shuffle and eyes the vulnerable doubled pawns. The king retreats to safety, aiming to consolidate defensive lines after the aggressive pawn thrust. A queen sacrifice, forcing a perpetual check to avoid immediate material loss and secure a draw. Securing the king is paramount now, as perpetual check might be the only escape from impending material loss. The monarch seeks safety, aiming to join the fight on the central files as the queens and pawns are exchanged. Creating a pawn barrier around the king introduces a new defensive posture, potentially limiting the opponent's avenues of attack. Opening the king side for a potential attack, this move also creates a crucial escape square for the monarch. A bold check, forcing the king into a less secure position, sacrificing tempo for a chance at counterplay. Pivoting the queen to this square opens aggressive attacking avenues and pressures the opponent's king. Shifting the queen to attack the pawn structure forces a pawn exchange and opens up lines. The king ventures out, seeking active participation in the final skirmish. Recentralizing the king offers a slightly more robust defense against the aggressive queen. This check forces black's king into a more exposed position, potentially opening new attacking avenues. The king's safety remains paramount. This maneuver aims to escape further checks and consolidate defensive lines. Reactivating the light-squared bishop aims to create threats on the king side, potentially opening lines for attack. Securing the queenside flank with a pawn advance aims to prevent potential pawn breaks by the opponent. The rook now becomes a potent attacking piece, leveraging the open c-file to threaten weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Shifting the queen to f1 aims to disrupt white's pieces and potentially activate the rook on f8, but neglects the queenside pawn structure. Capturing the pawn exposes the king to a devastating discovered attack along the queen's diagonal. This captures the rook and initiates a decisive attack on black's exposed monarch. Opening the c-file for the rook introduces a dynamic endgame scenario with immediate threats to black's queen and king. Reactivating the queen, this move aims to disrupt white's advancing pawns and potentially force exchanges to simplify. Securing the queen's outpost by advancing the king offers a promising positional advantage. A final defiant check, aiming to disrupt white's consolidating position before black's king faces further scrutiny. Securing the king's escape squares is paramount as the queens prepare for a potential exchange. A sharp counterattack, forcing a perpetual check and preventing immediate checkmate. Reactivating the king is a crucial endgame maneuver, seeking to escape the corner and join the fight. Asserting control of the c-file, this check forces the white king onto a precarious diagonal, seeking to exploit the exposed monarch. Pushing the king forward repositions the monarch for potential middle-game action and simplifies the board. Black's king safety deteriorates further as it shuffles again, seeking refuge from the open diagonals. Developing the bishop aims to bolster king's safety and prepare for potential queenside expansion. Securing the queen's escape route offers a glimmer of hope amidst this grim endgame. Securing the c-file opens avenues for the queen to exploit weaknesses on the queen side. A desperate check, seeking to disrupt white's unstoppable march to victory through a final cascade of checks. Shifting the monarch to safety is paramount given the exposed queenside pawns. Maintaining queen pressure on the 7th rank aims to unravel white's defense before the pawn structure solidifies. Sharpening the attack, this queen repositioning sets up a delightful fork on the next turn. Forcing the king into a more exposed central position through this check is a crucial step in consolidating the material advantage. Shifting the king to safety prepares to defend against queen incursions while avoiding immediate checks. A final aggressive queen sortie, seeking to disrupt the king's sanctuary before the inevitable checkmate sequence unfolds. Securing the queen's path to the king's position, this aims to disrupt black's defensive fortress. The queen retreats, sacrificing the pawn and creating a perpetual check scenario if white isn't careful. Anchoring the bishop to the d1 square solidifies the defense and prepares for potential queen exchanges, preventing further checks. The black king's hesitant dance toward the queen side now seems inevitable given the board's congestion. Activating the queen to exploit the undefended queenside squares forces a simplification and potential pawn acquisition. Attempting to shore up the king's defenses with a pawn advance, but this leaves the pawn structure vulnerable to white's persistent pressure. Recapturing the pawn on d4 immediately reestablishes central control and pressures black's isolated pawns. The king retreats to a safer square, avoiding any immediate mating nets. Unleashing a decisive check, forcing the king into a precarious corner where a swift mate looms. The king scurries towards the queen side, seeking refuge from the looming threats on the open squares. Securing the d-file allows white to bring the queen back into the game, potentially creating new threats. Seeking to disrupt white's king control and create active counterplay, this queen sortie forces immediate attention. Securing the king by advancing it forward prevents potential perpetual check patterns and prepares for a more active endgame role. Shifting the queen to the one square that offers maximum counterplay against white's isolated king. Snatching that pawn isolates the black king further, creating a dangerous outpost for your queen. Discovered attacks offer juicy tactical opportunities, and this check forces the king to a more exposed square. Securing the queen on a central square now prepares a more dynamic attack on the king side. Unleashing a desperate check in a lost position, seeking any tactical glimmer. Unleashing a final mating net with overwhelming queen pressure, aiming to corner the black king. The queen retreats, keeping the king's sanctuary from immediate threats while maintaining pressure on the central pawn structure. Securing the king amidst potential threats, the monarch seeks a safer haven, preparing for the ensuing struggle. A desperate gambit to chase the opponent's monarch across the board, hoping for a mistake. Steering the king towards the queen side seems a bit adventurous, leaving it exposed. Returning the queen to a safer square avoids immediate threats and prepares for further defensive maneuvers. King hunt initiated, forcing the black monarch to a less secure square and consolidating the initiative. Securing the king's sanctuary with that tempo-gaining check is a vital defensive maneuver amidst this tactical storm. King hunt concludes as white forces a perpetual check with queen opposition.